Greetings, YouTube. Have you ever known someone that asked you to call them by their middle name? I know I have. I used to work with the guys, my boss, an old boss, his name was Bill. Bill was not his first name. It was his middle name, William. His first name was Henry. He didn't like it. That's his call. He didn't have to like it. He asked me to call him by his middle name. I did. Have you ever known anybody that asked you to call him by a nickname? I used to work with a guy named, his nickname was Boomer. I once asked him, "Why is your name Boomer?" He said when he was in high school, he used to be really good at throwing long-distance basketballs. Okay, it was well after high school, and Boomer wasn't in any condition to play any kind of sport, but if he wanted to go by Boomer, then Boomer it is. Have you ever known anybody that changed their name? Now, my ex changed their last name, taking mine, their first name, and middle name, until by the time they were done and we separated, they didn't have any of their original names, and they kept my last name. I was fine with this. I still am fine with this. They can have that name forever. Go for it. So, can someone explain to me why it is that when a trans person asks to be called by a different name, that's a big issue for some people? Or, if they ask to be called by a different pronoun than the one that you had been calling them, or say you called them for the first time you met them, you called them by a pronoun that they don't want you to use. Why is that an issue? Society seems to be able to absorb people being called by their middle names, or by a nickname, or by legally changing their name. In fact, you can go by another name without having to have it legally changed, so long as you're not attempting to evade the law. And it's okay. Now, society can absorb all of those things without batting an eye. But for some reason, when a trans person steps forward and says, "Would you do this?" suddenly it's seen as a major burden. When in actuality, it's no more of a burden than all the other examples I've given. It's exactly the same burden. So if it's the same burden, and yet suddenly it's being seen as a burden, when it isn't, something else is going on. There's another mechanism involved in this process. It just isn't that they're being asked to be called by a different name or by a pronoun that you may not have necessarily thought was the appropriate one at the first meeting. Or they may ask you to use a pronoun that has changed over time as they come to understand their own particular gender identity more fully. And all of these things are no more of a burden than a nickname or a middle name or a name change. Like, say, for example, when someone gets married. We do all of these things every day and no one ever gets upset. And yet when a trans person asks, suddenly people do get upset. And since the amount of effort being expended is the same as things that don't upset people, what is the mechanism involved that makes people get upset? I'm going to go out on a limb here and say bigotry. Say discrimination. To say prejudice. Now, some of this is internalized and people aren't doing it overtly. They're being made uncomfortable by the situation and they may not understand why. It just doesn't feel right. But that isn't the trans person's problem now, is it? You're making it the trans person's problem. The trans person is asking for no more than what any other person has ever asked when it came to a name. We need to stop doing that. Now, some people are going to say, well, Tetsubo, you've talked about this topic before, and I have talked about this topic before. And I have this feeling that I shall be revisiting this topic in the future. Why? Because people aren't getting it. And people fight me on it constantly. Sometimes they get vicious, nasty, and brutal. Sometimes they get their asses blocked. And I have no problem with that. None whatsoever. I don't care if you're the first person that ever subscribed to my channel. You proved to me you're a transphobic bigot. Bye. Don't let the door hit you on the way out. We need to stop telling trans people that a name or a pronoun is a burden when it isn't. We need just to accept the fact that a name and a pronoun is the same as any other name change out there. All the different types of name changes that we use every day, and nobody cares. And if someone begins to get upset about that, you need to ask them why they're upset. And you need to give them the examples I've just given you. Nicknames, middle names, name changes, marriage name changes. And ask them, okay, how is what this person here right now is asking different than the things I've just mentioned? And if they sputter and they can't give you an answer, then ask them. You need to look a little bit deeper. Now tell me, what about this is upsetting